Sometimes life leaves you with nothing but broken dreams and the weight of starting over. For Eli Mason, that moment came standing before a rotting fishing boat that everyone in town called worthless junk. His wife was gone, his savings were empty, and his 10-year-old daughter June was asking if they'd have to live in the old boat now. The weathered dream sat behind Murphy's bait shop like a forgotten grave, all peeling paint and rusted metal. It was the only thing his estranged father had left him, the man who walked out when Eli was 12 and never looked back. The townspeople laughed and whispered. Here was Eli Mason, crawling back home with nothing to show for his life but debt and heartbreak. They saw a broken man and a worthless boat. But his father had been many things: cold, distant, cruel yet never careless. What if the old man had hidden something worth more than anyone imagined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harbor's End had always been the kind of town where everyone knew your business before you did. The morning fog rolled in from the Atlantic like clockwork, wrapping the weathered buildings in gray silence before the sun burned it away, to reveal another day of the same conversations, the same faces, the same predictable rhythms that had defined this place for generations. Eli Mason had grown up counting those fog-wrapped mornings, dreaming of the day he'd leave this suffocating familiarity behind. Now, 38 years old and standing in the gravel parking lot behind Murphy's bait shop, he wondered if coming back had been surrender, or the only choice he had left. The weathered dream looked even worse in the harsh morning light. What had once been a proud 32-foot fishing vessel now resembled a beached whale, her hull streaked with rust stains like tears. Barnacles clung to her waterline, despite being landlocked for the better part of a decade. Weeds pushed through gaps in her deck planking, and her mast leaned at an angle that suggested either neglect or defeat. "She's been sitting there since your old man passed," came a gravelly voice behind him. Eli turned to see Murphy himself emerging from the bait shop, wiping his hands on a stained apron. Tom Murphy had been ancient when Eli was a boy, and the years hadn't been kind. His face was a roadmap of sun damage and hard living, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence of a man who'd spent his life reading weather and water. "Tom," Eli nodded, unsure of what else to say. The last time they'd spoken, Eli had been 17 and full of rage about his father's latest disappearance. "Heard you were back in town. Sorry about Sarah." Murphy's condolences carried the weight of genuine sympathy. Small towns had their flaws, but they also had long memories for both pain and kindness. "Thank you." The words came out rougher than Eli intended. Even 9 months after the cancer had taken his wife, speaking about it felt like swallowing glass. Murphy gestured toward the boat with a tilt of his weathered chin. "Your father, he used to come by every few weeks, just sat there looking at her, sometimes for hours. Never said much, but I could tell she meant something to him." Eli felt his jaw tighten. She meant more to him than his son ever did. "That's not true, boy, and you know it." The voice belonged to Mrs. Chen, who had appeared as if materialized from the morning air. Elena Chen was Harbor's End's unofficial keeper of hearts and secrets, a widow who'd raised 3 children and half the town's strays, with equal measures of fierce love and practical wisdom. She'd been Eli's refuge during the worst of his childhood storms. Mrs. Chen. Despite everything, Eli found himself almost smiling. She looked exactly the same: silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, cardigan that had seen better decades, and eyes that missed nothing. "Elena is fine, dear. You're not 12 anymore." She studied his face with the intensity of someone reading a familiar book for changes. "Though you look like you haven't been sleeping much. It's been a difficult year." "I imagine so. And how is June handling all this?" At the mention of his daughter, some of the tension left Eli's shoulders. "She's stronger than I am, always has been. Children often are. They haven't learned yet that the world is supposed to break their hearts." Mrs. Chen moved closer to the boat, running her fingers along the weathered gunwale with surprising gentleness. "Your father loved this boat, you know. But not for the reasons you think. I don't want to hear about my father's loves, Eli said, the old bitterness rising like bile in his throat. He made his choices clear enough when I was growing up. Murphy and Mrs. Chen exchanged a look that Eli couldn't quite read, but he'd seen similar expressions often enough in small towns. The look that said there were things he didn't understand, stories he hadn't been told. Sometimes, Mrs. Chen said carefully, a man's choices look different when you understand what he was choosing between. Before Eli could respond, the sound of running feet on gravel announced June's arrival. His daughter appeared around the corner of the bait shop, her long brown hair streaming behind her, cheeks flushed from the short run from their temporary lodging at the Harbor Inn. At 10, she had her mother's grace and her father's stubborn chin, along with a curiosity that seemed to expand daily. "Dad, you left without eating breakfast again," she said, slightly out of breath, but wearing the expression of someone who'd appointed herself the family's voice of reason. "I had coffee." "Coffee isn't breakfast." Mrs. Patterson at the diner said coffee is what grown-ups drink when they're pretending they're not hungry. June's logic was, as usual, difficult to argue with. Mrs. Chen laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Smart girl. Takes after her mother, I hope. She takes after whoever she thinks will get her the best result at any given moment," Eli said. But there was pride in his voice. June had navigated the past year with a resilience that both amazed and worried him. Children shouldn't have to be that strong. June was studying the boat with the intense focus she usually reserved for puzzles or books that were slightly above her reading level. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," she said finally. "And sadder." "Sadder?" Eli asked. "Like it's been waiting for someone to remember it exists." She climbed onto a weathered crate to get a better look at the deck. "Can we go inside?" "I don't think that's safe, sweetheart. The whole thing might be rotting through." But Murphy was already moving toward the boat, pulling out a set of keys from his pocket. "Actually, your father had me check on her regular like. Structure's sound enough. Needs work, sure, but she's not falling down anytime soon." Eli watched as Murphy unlocked a small padlock, securing a canvas tarp over the cabin entrance. The metallic sound seemed to echo in the morning air, and for a moment, Eli felt something twist in his chest, anticipation mixed with dread. "Your father," Murphy continued, pulling back the tarp. "He spent a lot of time down in that cabin, reading mostly. Sometimes writing in that journal of his." He paused, glancing at Eli. "Said he was trying to figure something out. Something important." The cabin door swung open to reveal an interior that was surprising in its preservation. While the exterior of the boat had surrendered to weather and time, the inside told a different story. The small galley was clean, if dated. Charts and navigation equipment sat neatly arranged on a fold-down table. Cushions on the small berth looked recently aired. Most surprising of all, there was no smell of mildew or rot, just a faint scent of salt air, and something else, tobacco maybe, or old leather. June was already climbing down the short ladder into the cabin, her natural fearlessness overriding any adult caution. "Dad, there are so many books down here. And maps." Eli followed her down, Murphy and Mrs. Chen peering in from above. The cabin was cramped but organized, everything secured in the way of someone who understood boats and weather. Charts covered one wall, held in place by thin wooden strips. A small bookshelf contained volumes on maritime history, navigation, and what appeared to be local folklore. On the tiny galley counter sat a coffee mug, as if his father had just stepped out for a moment. "He was here a lot, especially the last few years," Murphy said quietly. "Sometimes I'd see lights down there late at night, always working on something, always studying those charts." June had discovered a small cabinet beside the berth, and was trying to work its latch. "Dad, this one's stuck." Eli moved to help her, and as his fingers found the small brass catch, something clicked, not just the latch, but something deeper, like a memory trying to surface. His father had taught him about boats when he was very young, before the distance and anger had grown between them. There had been summer afternoons when his father's hands had guided his own on tillers and lines, when the old man's voice had been patient and kind, rather than distracted and bitter. The cabinet opened to reveal a small collection of personal items, an old compass, some nautical instruments that looked like antiques, and underneath it all, a photograph. Eli lifted the photo carefully. It was water damaged around the edges, but still recognizable himself at perhaps 6 years old, sitting on the bow of this very boat, grinning widely while his father's hands steadied him from behind. His father looked younger than Eli, remembered ever seeing him, genuinely happy in a way that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. I remember that day, Mrs. Chen said softly. She'd climbed partway down into the cabin and was looking over Eli's shoulder. It was right after he bought the boat. He was so proud, so excited to share it with you. Eli stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the man in the picture with his memories of cold silences and long absences. What happened to him? What changed? Life, Mrs. Chen said simply. Life happened, and your father, well, he wasn't always good at explaining himself. He thought actions spoke louder than words, but sometimes his actions were hard to understand. June was exploring the rest of the cabin with the thoroughness of a young detective. She'd found another small compartment near the navigation station and was working at its latch with the persistence of someone who believed every lock had a key. Careful, June, Eli warned, but she'd already managed to spring the catch. There's something in here, she announced, reaching into the small space. She pulled out what appeared to be a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by handling. It looks like a diary. Eli took the journal from her, feeling its weight. The leather was soft with age, and the pages fell open naturally to entries written in his father's familiar handwriting, precise, economical letters that had always reminded Eli of navigation charts. The first entry he could see clearly was dated just 2 years ago. The coordinates from the 1943 storm reports finally make sense. The current patterns have shifted over 70 years, but the landmarks remain. EM was right about the depth measurements. Tomorrow I'll try the southern approach. EM, Eli murmured, running his finger over the initials. Your grandfather, Mrs. Chen said. Ezra Mason. He was a fisherman here before your father, and his father before him. 3 generations of Mason men working these waters. Eli flipped through more pages, finding entries that spoke of searches and coordinates, of the deep cache, and 30 years of looking. There were hand-drawn charts, tide calculations, and references to historical events he didn't understand. What was he looking for, he asked, more to himself than to anyone else. Murphy cleared his throat. Your father never said directly, but there were stories. Old-timers talked about a ship that went down in the big storm of 1943, not a fishing boat, something bigger. Government vessel, some said. Others claimed it was carrying cargo that folks would pay handsomely to recover. Treasure? June asked, her eyes lighting up with the possibility. Maybe, Murphy said carefully. Or maybe just an old man's obsession with something that couldn't be found. But as Eli continued reading, the entries seemed too detailed, too systematic for simple obsession. His father had approached whatever he was doing with the methodical patience of a professional researcher. Weather patterns, historical records, detailed measurements. This wasn't the work of someone chasing fantasies. Mrs. Chen was watching him with an expression that suggested she knew more than she was saying. Your father left you this boat for a reason, Eli. Maybe it's time you tried to understand what that reason was. The morning sun was streaming through the cabin's small windows now, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Eli could hear the distant sounds of Harbor's End, waking up cars starting, doors closing, the everyday symphony of a small town beginning another day. But inside the cabin, surrounded by his father's careful documentation of some unknown quest, he felt removed from that ordinary world. Dad, June was looking at him with concern. Are you okay? He realized he'd been silent for several minutes, lost in the journal's pages. I'm fine, sweetheart, just trying to understand something. About Grandpa? About Grandpa, yes. June nodded with the serious acceptance of a child who'd learned to trust her father's judgment, even when she didn't understand it. Can we keep the boat? The question caught him off guard. Keep it? He'd come here planning to sell it for whatever scrap value it might have, hoping to pay down even a small portion of the debts that followed Sarah's medical bills like hungry wolves. I don't know if we can afford to keep it, June. But it's ours now, right? It belonged to Grandpa, and now it belongs to us. Mrs. Chen and Murphy were watching this exchange with the careful attention of people who understood that sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words. Legally, yes, Eli said finally. But keeping it means maintenance, storage fees, insurance. It means having something that was his. June interrupted, and there was something in her voice that made Eli look at her more closely. I never met him, but this was important to him. Maybe it could be important to us too. Standing in that small cabin, holding his father's journal and looking at his daughter's hopeful face, Eli felt something shift inside him. Not the crushing weight of financial desperation that had driven him back to Harbor's End, but something lighter possibility. Maybe, or just the faintest suggestion, that the story he'd been telling himself about his father might not be the whole truth. Tell you what, he said, surprising himself. Let's spend some time here today. Look through his things, try to understand what he was working on, then we'll decide. June's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Really? Really? As they climbed back up onto the deck, Murphy pulled Eli aside. Your father paid me a year's storage in advance before he passed. Boat's yours free and clear until next spring. Gives you time to think. Why didn't you tell me that sooner? Murphy's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. Because you needed to decide you wanted to know, not be told you had to. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of discovery. They found more journals, more charts, diving equipment that looked professional grade, and boxes of research materials that suggested his father had been in correspondence with maritime historians and treasure recovery specialists. Each discovery complicated the picture Eli had carried of his father as a selfish dreamer who'd abandoned his family for impossible pursuits. By afternoon, June had appointed herself the expedition's official archivist, carefully organizing papers and creating lists with the methodical enthusiasm of someone who'd found her calling. Chen had appeared with sandwiches and cold drinks, settling herself on an overturned crate to supervise and offer commentary on each new revelation. Your father was a proud man, she said as Eli showed her a letter from a university researcher expressing interest in his father's historical findings. Sometimes too proud to ask for help when he needed it, too proud to explain when he was misunderstood. He could have tried, Eli said, but there was less anger in it than there had been that morning. Yes, he could have. But pride is a funny thing. It can look like strength when it's really fear, or like independence when it's really protection. She studied him with those knowing eyes. You come by it honestly. As the sun began to set, painting Harbor's End in shades of gold and amber, Eli found himself reluctant to leave the boat. There was something about being surrounded by his father's careful work, his patient documentation of some grand search, that made the old man feel more real than he had in years. Dad, June said, settling beside him on the deck where they'd been watching the last light fade from the sky. I think Grandpa left us more than just a boat. What do you mean? I think he left us a mystery, and I think, she paused, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone who wanted to be taken seriously. I think maybe he wanted us to solve it. Eli looked at his daughter, this remarkable child who'd inherited her mother's wisdom and some indefinable quality that seemed uniquely her own. That's a pretty big mystery for a 10-year-old and her dad. Maybe, June said. But we're pretty good at figuring things out when we work together. As they packed up the journals and charts to take back to their hotel room, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in months: curiosity about tomorrow. Not just the grinding necessity of surviving another day, but genuine interest in what they might discover next. The weathered dream sat in the gathering darkness like a keeper of secrets, and for the first time since inheriting her, Eli began to think those secrets might be worth keeping. 3 days of reading his father's journals had left Eli with more questions than answers, but also with something he hadn't expected, a growing respect for the methodical intelligence behind the search. His father hadn't been chasing fantasies. He'd been conducting research with the patience of a scholar and the precision of a scientist. The morning sun filtered through the boat's cabin windows as Eli sat cross-legged on the small berth, surrounded by charts and notebooks. June was at the navigation table, carefully copying coordinates into a spiral notebook she'd designated as their treasure hunting journal. She'd thrown herself into the mystery with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found an adventure worthy of her attention. "Dad, look at this," she said, holding up one of the charts. Grandpa marked the same area on 3 different maps, but the marks are slightly different each time. Eli looked over her shoulder. She was right. The coordinates his father had circled shifted slightly from map to map, as if he'd been refining his target over time. "Good eye, sweetheart. What do you think that means?" Maybe he was getting closer to something, like when you're looking for something you dropped and you keep narrowing down where it might be. Her innocent analogy struck closer to the truth than she probably realized. Eli had been reading about search patterns and grid systems, learning that treasure recovery was as much about systematic elimination as it was about lucky discovery. He was reaching for another journal when his fingers found something unexpected, a slight depression in the wood beneath the captain's chair. Pressing against it, he felt the wood give slightly, as if it wasn't quite solid. "June, come look at this." She scrambled over, and together they examined the area more closely. What had seemed like a solid piece of decking revealed itself to be a carefully constructed panel, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. "Is it a secret compartment?" June whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make it disappear. "Let's find out." Eli worked his fingers around the edges until he found a small catch hidden in the grain of the wood. With a soft click, the panel lifted away to reveal a space about the size of a shoebox. Inside was another journal, this one newer than the others, along with what appeared to be diving equipment, a waterproof case, depth gauge, and underwater camera. But it was the journal that drew Eli's attention. Unlike the others, this one was locked with a small brass clasp. June produced a paperclip from her pocket, with the efficiency of someone who'd appointed herself the expedition's problem solver. "I learned how to pick locks from a book Mrs. Patterson gave me." "Mrs. Patterson taught you lock picking?" "She said it was important for girls to know how to get into places they weren't supposed to be." June worked the paperclip with surprising skill, her tongue poking out in concentration. After a few moments, the clasp clicked open. The first page was dated just 6 months before his father's death, and the handwriting was shakier than in the earlier journals, as if written by someone whose hands weren't quite steady. "If someone is reading this, it means I'm gone, and the secret dies with me unless I can find a way to pass it on. 37 years I've been searching for the Santa Isabella, and I finally found her. But finding her and recovering her cargo are 2 different things, and I'm running out of time." Eli felt his breath catch. The Santa Isabella. He'd seen references to that name in other journals, but hadn't understood its significance. The storm of October 15, 1943, sank her 3 miles northeast of Devil's Point, in 68 feet of water. She wasn't just any cargo ship, she was carrying art and gold that the Nazis had stolen, being transported to safety by the underground resistance, 111 million worth. By today's standards. June gasped. "Dad, is that real? $111 million. Eli kept reading, his father's words painting a picture that was both thrilling and terrifying. "I've located the wreck using side-scan sonar equipment I borrowed from the university. The cargo is still there, protected by the ship's hull and the cold Atlantic water. But I'm not the only one who knows about it. There are people, powerful people who've been watching my research, waiting for me to find what they couldn't find themselves." The entries grew more urgent as Eli turned the pages. "They approached me last month, offered to buy my research for a fraction of what the treasure is worth. When I refused, They made it clear that wasn't really a request. I've hidden copies of everything, including the exact coordinates, but I'm afraid they'll come after Eli if they think he knows something. Eli's hands were shaking now. His father's abandonment hadn't been abandonment at all, it had been protection. If my son is reading this, I need him to know. I left not because I didn't love him, but because I loved him too much to let him get caught up in this. The treasure isn't just money, it's justice. Those art pieces belong to families the Nazis destroyed. The gold was stolen from people who were murdered for it. It needs to be returned to the rightful owners, not sold to the highest bidder. June was reading over his shoulder, her eyes wide. Grandpa was trying to do the right thing. It looks that way. Eli's throat felt tight. All those years of anger, of believing his father had chosen treasure over family, and the truth was exactly the opposite. I've made arrangements with Dr. Sarah Mackenzie at the Maritime Heritage Foundation. She knows about the wreck and has the resources to handle the recovery legally and ethically. If something happens to me, Eli should contact her. The coordinates are hidden in the boat itself, not in any journal or chart, but in the structure. Look for the compass rose carved into the helm housing. Eli looked up at the boat's small wheel, then at June. Without a word, they both moved to examine the helm more closely. Sure enough, etched so faintly into the brass housing that it was nearly invisible, was a compass rose with numbers worked into its design. Those are coordinates. June breathed. But their discovery was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the dock above, heavy boots, moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of morning fishermen. Mr. Mason? The voice was polite, but carried an undertone that made Eli's skin crawl. We'd like to have a word with you. Eli quickly closed the journal and slipped it into his jacket, motioning for June to stay quiet. They climbed up from the cabin to find 3 men standing on the dock. They wore expensive suits that looked out of place in Harbor's End, and their faces had the neutral expressions of people who were very good at not revealing what they were thinking. I'm Eli Mason. What can I do for you? The man in the middle, tall and thin with silver hair, smiled without warmth. My name is Charles Whitman. I represent certain parties who had business dealings with your late father. My father didn't have business dealings. He was a fisherman. Oh, but he was so much more than that, wasn't he? Whitman's eyes moved to the boat, taking in details with the efficiency of someone cataloging assets. He was a researcher, a treasure hunter you might say, and we believe he may have left certain information that belongs to our clients. I don't know what you're talking about. Whitman's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Mr. Mason, let's not play games. Your father spent decades researching the location of a certain vessel. Our clients invested significant resources in that research, and they're naturally interested in seeing some return on their investment. June moved closer to Eli, and he put a protective arm around her shoulders. My father left me a boat. That's all. A boat, yes, but boats can hold many things, can't they? Charts, journals, coordinates. Whitman stepped closer. Our clients are prepared to be very generous for any information your father may have left behind. Much more generous than the government would be, should this become an official matter. The threat was politely wrapped, but unmistakable. Eli felt anger rising in his chest, not just at these men, but at the situation his father had left him in. Even in death, the old man's secrets were putting his family in danger. I need to think about this, Eli said carefully. Of course, but don't think too long. Whitman reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. You have until tomorrow evening to decide. After that, our clients may feel compelled to explore other options. The 3 men walked away with the casual confidence of people who expected to get what they wanted. Eli watched them go, his mind racing. Dad, June's voice was small. Are we in trouble? Eli looked down at his daughter, this brave, brilliant child who'd already lost her mother and shouldn't have to be afraid of men in expensive suits. The anger crystallized into something harder: determination. No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. But I think it's time we learned the truth about what your grandfather was trying to do. That evening, back in their hotel room, Eli made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. He was going to finish what his father had started. Not for the money, though God knew they needed it, but for the justice his father had written about, and for the daughter who deserved to be proud of her family's legacy. He picked up his phone and dialed the number he'd found in his father's contacts. Dr. Mackenzie, this is Eli Mason. I think it's time we talked. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie arrived at Harbor's End the next morning, like a breath of fresh ocean air. She was younger than Eli, had expected perhaps 35, with sun-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of diving in challenging waters. Her handshake was firm, her eyes direct, and when she looked at the weathered dream, Eli saw the same careful assessment his father might have made. Your father was a remarkable man, she said without preamble. Stubborn as hell, brilliant, and absolutely dedicated to doing the right thing. I'm sorry for your loss. They were standing on the dock beside the boat, early morning fog, still clinging to the harbor. June sat on a nearby piling, openly studying Dr. Mackenzie with the intense curiosity she usually reserved for new books or particularly interesting puzzles. He never mentioned you, Eli said, not unkindly but needing to establish the boundaries of his trust. He wouldn't have. Your father was paranoid about security, especially after he realized he was being watched. Sarah's expression grew serious. The men who visited you yesterday, they've been circling this project for years, waiting for someone else to do the dangerous work of actually finding the wreck. So the Santa Isabella is real. Oh, it's real, and so is the cargo she was carrying. Sarah pulled a tablet from her backpack and showed them historical documents, shipping manifests, insurance records, correspondence between resistance fighters and Allied officials. October 1943. She was carrying recovered Nazi plunder, being transported to safety. Art pieces, stolen from Jewish families, gold looted from occupied territories, cultural artifacts that represented centuries of heritage. June leaned forward to get a better look at the screen. Is that a painting by Van Gogh? Very good eye. Yes, that's one of the pieces that was being transported, along with works by Monet, Degas, and several old masters. The total value today would be astronomical, but the historical significance is beyond price. Eli studied the manifest. His father's obsession suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't just about treasure hunting. Your father understood that this was about justice. Those art pieces belong to families, museums, cultural institutions. They need to be returned to their rightful owners, not sold to private collectors who'll hide them away forever. Sarah closed the tablet and looked directly at Eli. The question is, are you prepared to finish what he started? Because I have to warn you, it won't be easy. The people who approached you yesterday have resources and connections. They've been patient for decades, but now that the wreck has been located, they won't wait much longer. How do you know it's been located? Because your father contacted me 3 weeks before he died. He'd found it, confirmed the cargo was intact, but he needed help with the legal framework for recovery. We were planning the operation when... She paused, her expression growing darker. When he had his accident. Accident? Eli felt cold certainty settling in his stomach. His death wasn't an accident, was it? Sarah's silence was answer enough. June had been following the conversation with growing alarm. Someone hurt Grandpa because of the treasure. We can't prove that, Sarah said carefully, but the timing was suspicious. Your father was scheduled to meet with federal authorities about the wreck. Someone may have decided he was becoming too much of a liability. Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His father had died protecting this secret, and now it was his burden to carry. But looking at June's determined expression, he realized it wasn't a burden he had to carry alone. What do we need to do? Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving. First, we need to verify the coordinates your father left. Then we need to document everything thoroughly, before anyone else gets involved. And we need to move fast. They spent the rest of the morning examining the compass rose carved into the helm housing. The numbers worked into the design were subtle, requiring careful measurement and calculation to decode. June proved surprisingly helpful with the mathematics, her natural aptitude for puzzles, making her an ideal assistant for the painstaking work. Got it, Sarah announced finally, after cross-referencing the numbers with nautical charts. 3.2 miles northeast of Devil's Point, at bearing 047 degrees. Depth should be around 68 feet. That matches what was in the journal, Eli confirmed. Then we have our target. Sarah looked at the boat with professional assessment. The Weather Dream isn't ideal for technical diving, but she'll work for initial reconnaissance. Your father had the right ideas. A local boat, stay low profile, avoid attracting attention. I haven't been diving in years, Eli admitted. It comes back to you, like riding a bicycle, but with more potential for drowning. Sarah's attempt at humor didn't quite mask the seriousness of what they were contemplating. We'll start with shallow practice dives, get you comfortable with the equipment again. That afternoon, they moved the boat to Murphy's private slip, ostensibly for routine maintenance. Murphy asked no questions, but his knowing look suggested he understood more than he was saying. Mrs. Chen appeared with a thermos of coffee and sandwiches, taking up her usual position as unofficial supervisor of the operation. Your father tried to teach you diving when you were young, she observed, watching as Sarah checked over the equipment they'd found in the boat's hidden compartments. He did, Eli acknowledged. The memories were fuzzy but warm patient instruction in shallow water, his father's hands steadying him as he learned to breathe through a regulator. I was maybe 8 or 9. He was proud of how quickly you learned. Used to say you had natural water sense, like it was in your blood. June looked up from the diving manual she'd been studying. Can I learn too? Absolutely not, Eli said immediately. But Dad, I'm a good swimmer, and... June, this isn't a swimming pool. We're talking about deep ocean diving, potentially dangerous conditions, and people who might not want us to succeed. His daughter's expression suggested this conversation was far from over, but she nodded with the grudging acceptance of someone who recognized a non-negotiable decision. Sarah emerged from the cabin carrying what looked like a modified depth sounder. Your father was more prepared than I thought. This is professional-grade side-scan sonar equipment. With this, we can map the ocean floor and locate the wreck without guesswork. How long will that take? If the coordinates are accurate, a few hours. If we need to search a wider area, could be days. She paused, looking out at the harbor where several boats moved through the afternoon light. But I'm more concerned about those friends of yours. They're not going to wait indefinitely. As if summoned by her words, Eli spotted a familiar figure on the far side of the harbor, Charles Whitman, standing beside a sleek powerboat that definitely didn't belong to any local fisherman. Even at a distance, the man's attention seemed focused on their activity. They're watching us, he told Sarah. She followed his gaze and swore softly. Then we need to be smarter than them. Tonight, we take the boat out for what looks like a sunset cruise. Casual, nothing suspicious. But we'll actually be running a preliminary sonar sweep of the target area. What if they follow us? They probably will. But following and stopping us are two different things. As long as we're in open water, there's not much they can do except watch. The afternoon passed in preparation. Sarah walked Eli through the sonar equipment, refreshed his memory on diving protocols, and helped him plot their evening route. June made herself useful by organizing charts and taking detailed notes in her treasure hunting journal, approaching the task with the methodical enthusiasm of someone who'd found her calling. As the sun began to set, painting Harbor's End in shades of gold and crimson, they prepared to take the Weather Dream out for what might be the most important evening cruise of their lives. Dad, June said as they prepared to cast off. I know you're worried about those men, but I think Grandpa would be proud of what we're doing. Eli looked at his daughter, this remarkable child who'd inherited not just her mother's wisdom, but apparently her grandfather's sense of justice as well. I think you're right, sweetheart. The engine turned over with a satisfying rumble, and the Weather Dream pulled away from her slip with the quiet dignity of a vessel finally returning to her proper element. Behind them, Harbor's End grew smaller in the gathering dusk. Ahead lay open water, hidden secrets, and the promise of answers that had been 37 years in the making. The brass sextant caught the last rays of sunset as Eli lifted it from its case, the engraved initials, E.M., clearly visible on its curved frame. His grandfather's sextanta piece of family history he'd never known existed. Ezra Mason, Sarah said, reading the inscription. Your father mentioned him often, said he was the one who first heard the stories about the Santa Isabella. They were 3 miles offshore now, the weathered Dream, moving steadily through calm evening waters. Behind them, just within visual range, the sleek powerboat maintained its distance, like a patient predator. Eli had been watching it in the boat's mirrors, noting how it matched their speed and course changes with professional precision. June was at the bow, nominally watching for floating debris but actually serving as their lookout. Her young eyes were sharper than either adult's, and she'd already spotted 2 other boats that seemed to be maintaining suspicious interest in their course. Tell me about the sextant, Eli said, settling the instrument carefully back in its case. Sarah consulted the chart spread across the navigation table. According to your father's research, Ezra was fishing these waters in October 1943 when the storm hit. He was one of the few boats that made it back to harbor, and he reported seeing a large vessel in distress just before the worst of the weather struck. He saw the Santa Isabella go down? More than that. Ezra tried to mount a rescue operation the next day, but the military cordoned off the area. Told him it was classified, national security, stay away or face arrest. Sarah traced a course on the chart with her finger. But Ezra was curious, and fishermen know these waters better than any government official. The boat's engine settled into a steady rhythm as Eli adjusted their heading toward the coordinates hidden in the compass rose. The sonar equipment hummed quietly beneath the navigation table, already beginning to map the ocean floor. So grandfather knew where the ship went down. He had a good idea, but 1943 technology wasn't precise enough for exact coordinates, and the government classified everything related to the incident. Ezra spent years trying to piece together what he'd seen, but he never had the resources for a proper search. June called back from the bow. Dad, there's another boat coming from the north, big one. Eli looked up to see what appeared to be a Coast Guard cutter, heading in their general direction. Sarah frowned at the radar screen, then relaxed slightly. Routine patrol probably, but let's not take any chances. She adjusted the sonar equipment to passive mode, reducing its electronic signature. To any observer, they would appear to be exactly what they claimed a family, taking an evening cruise in their inherited fishing boat. Your father was methodical, Sarah continued, pulling out another folder of documents. He spent decades cross-referencing Ezra's observations with weather records, military reports, insurance claims, and shipping manifests. Look at this. She showed them a detailed timeline of the October 1943 storm, complete with wind patterns, tide charts, and reported ship positions. Eli's father had assembled the information with the patience of a professional historian. This is incredible work, Eli said, studying the meticulous documentation. He really was researching this properly. Your father understood that treasure hunting isn't about luck, it's about preparation and persistence. He knew that if he could find the Santa Isabella, he had to do it legally and ethically, or risk losing everything to people who didn't care about returning stolen art to its rightful owners. The sonar screen flickered to life with the first images of the ocean floor 60 feet below. At this depth, the bottom was relatively flat, scarred by decades of trawling nets, but otherwise unremarkable. June had moved to the stern and was studying the pursuing powerboat through a pair of binoculars she'd found in the cabin. They're not trying to hide anymore. I can see 3 men on deck, and they're definitely watching us. Let them watch, Sarah said grimly. As long as we're in international waters, there's nothing they can do but follow. But as if to contradict her words, Eli's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was blocked, but he had a sinking feeling about who might be calling. Mr. Mason, came Charles Whitman's smooth voice. Lovely evening for a boat ride. I don't know what you're talking about. Please. You're 3 miles northeast of Devil's Point, running what appears to be sonar equipment, accompanied by Dr. Mackenzie from the Maritime Heritage Foundation. Shall I continue? Eli felt his jaw tighten. They were being watched more closely than he'd realized. What do you want? The same thing I wanted yesterday. Information that belongs to our clients. The difference is that now you're actively interfering with a legitimate salvage operation. Legitimate according to who? According to maritime law, Mr. Mason, my clients have filed proper salvage claims with the appropriate authorities. Any treasure recovered from these waters legally belongs to them. Sarah was shaking her head vigorously, mouthing the word, lies. But Whitman's confidence was unsettling. You have 1 hour to return to harbor and turn over your father's research materials. Whitman continued. After that, we'll be forced to contact the Coast Guard about unauthorized salvage activities in restricted waters. The line went dead. Eli looked at Sarah, who was already pulling out her own phone. He's bluffing, she said, but her fingers were flying over the screen, checking legal databases. There are no legitimate salvage claims on file for this area, and these aren't restricted waters. But he could file claims. Not without proving prior discovery and investment. Your father's research establishes prior claim, especially if we can prove continuous investigation over multiple decades. The Coast Guard cutter had changed course and was now heading directly toward them. June pointed it out, her voice tight with worry. Dad, they're coming this way. Sarah cursed under her breath. They must have contacts in the guard. This is moving faster than I expected. Eli felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Retreat now, and they might lose the only chance to recover his father's treasure. Continue the search, and they risked legal complications that could destroy any hope of a legitimate recovery. What would your father do? Sarah asked quietly. The answer came to him with surprising clarity. His father would have been prepared for this moment. 37 years of planning wouldn't have left this kind of contingency to chance. June, check that navigation table. Look for anything marked emergency coordinates or backup plan. His daughter immediately began examining the charts with renewed focus. Within minutes, she'd found what they were looking for, a small notation in his father's careful handwriting. Plan B 42 degrees 17, 7339, W. Sarah quickly plotted the coordinates. That's interesting. It's about 2 miles south of here, in much shallower water, 20-foot depth, maybe 25. Why would he mark shallow water as a backup plan? Maybe he found something else, or maybe... Sarah's eyes widened as she checked the sonar readings. Eli, look at this. The screen showed what appeared to be a large, regular shape on the ocean floor. Not the scattered debris of a broken ship, but something intact and substantial. Is that the Santa Isabella? It's definitely a ship, the right size, the right general location. Sarah was adjusting the sonar settings to get a clearer image. But something's not right about the depth. Your father's research said 68 feet, not 45. The Coast Guard cutter was close enough now that they could see uniformed figures on deck. A spotlight swept across the water, clearly searching for something specific. Decision time, Sarah said grimly. We can stay and face whatever legal challenges they throw at us, or we can follow your father's backup plan and see what's at those emergency coordinates. Eli looked at June, who was watching him with complete trust, despite the danger they were facing. His daughter deserved to know the truth about her grandfather, and she deserved to be proud of her family's legacy. We follow Plan B, he decided. But first, we document everything we found here. Sarah was already taking screenshots of the sonar readings and GPS coordinates. Got it. Whatever happens next, we have proof that your father was right about the location. As the weathered Dream changed course toward the emergency coordinates, the pursuing powerboat fell back slightly, apparently confused by the sudden change in direction. The Coast Guard cutter continued on its original course, either having lost interest or having been recalled by whoever had sent it. Dad, June said as they approached the new coordinates. I think I understand why Grandpa called these emergency coordinates. What do you mean? She pointed to the chart, where the emergency position was marked in relation to tidal patterns and coastal features. If something went wrong at the main site, this would be where the current would carry debris. It's like a backup plan for the ocean itself. Eli stared at his daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. At 10 years old, she was already thinking like the kind of researcher her grandfather had been. The sonar screen flickered again as they passed over the new coordinates, and what it showed made all three of them fall silent. There, in 22 feet of crystal clear water, lay what was unmistakably a ship's hull. But this wasn't the scattered wreckage of a storm-sunk vessel. This was something that had been deliberately concealed, carefully preserved, and patiently waiting for the right people to find it. That's not the Santa Isabella, Sarah breathed. No, Eli agreed, understanding flooding through him like cold seawater. That's where my father hid the cargo after he recovered it. The waterproof case emerged from its hiding place beneath the boat's floorboards like a time capsule, its contents preserved with the meticulous care of someone who understood that documents could be more valuable than gold. Sarah opened it with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient artifacts, revealing a correspondence that would reshape everything they thought they knew about Eli's father. The letters were dated over a span of 15 years, exchanged between Eli's father and Dr. Margaret Thornton, Director of Maritime Archaeological Research at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. The earliest letter, dated 1998, was formal and Cortiusa, local fisherman requesting information about historical shipwrecks. The most recent, written just months before his father's death, read like communication between old colleagues. Listen to this, Sarah said, reading from a letter dated 2 years ago. Margaret, the final dive confirmed what we suspected. The Santa Isabella broke apart during the sinking, and the cargo was scattered across nearly half a mile of ocean floor. However, I've successfully recovered 60% of the manifest items and relocated them to the secondary site as discussed. The remaining pieces will require professional equipment and a proper archaeological team. Eli felt his worldview shifting again. He wasn't just treasure hunting. He was conducting a legitimate archaeological operation. With proper academic oversight, Sarah confirmed, flipping through more correspondence. Look at this detailed cataloging of recovered items, photographs, provenance, documentation. Your father spent decades learning proper archaeological techniques. June was sitting cross-legged on the deck, copying important passages into her treasure journal. The pursuit boats had fallen back to a respectful distance, apparently content to watch and wait. The Coast Guard cutter had disappeared entirely, leaving them alone with their discoveries in the gathering dusk. Here's the important part, Sarah continued, holding up a letter written in different handwriting. This is from Dr. Thornton. Robert, I've completed the authentication process for the pieces you've recovered. They match the insurance records from 1943 exactly. The Van Gogh alone is worth $12 million, and the Monet landscape, if it's genuine, could be worth 20. But more importantly, we've identified the original owners for 60% of the collection. These aren't just valuable paintings, they're pieces of family history stolen by the Nazis and never returned. The weight of responsibility settled on Eli's shoulders like a heavy coat. This wasn't just about financial salvation anymore, it was about justice for families who'd been robbed of their heritage 70 years ago. There's more, Sarah said, unfolding what appeared to be an official document. Your father filed preliminary papers with the State Department's Holocaust Art Recovery Program. He was working through proper channels to ensure the recovered pieces would be returned to their rightful owners or their heirs. Then why all the secrecy? Eli asked. Why not work openly with the authorities? Sarah's expression darkened as she found another set of documents. Because of this, letters from Whitman's organization Meridian Recovery Corporation. They've been pressuring your father for years, claiming salvage rights based on something called prior investment in research infrastructure. What does that mean? It means they've been funding maritime research in this area for decades, not out of academic interest, but to establish legal claims to anything that might be recovered. It's a common practice among treasure hunting corporations. They invest small amounts in legitimate research, then claim ownership of any discoveries. June looked up from her notebook. So they were trying to steal Grandpa's treasure legally? Essentially, yes. And your father knew that if he worked through normal channels, Meridian would tie everything up in courts for years, while the real treasure hunters, the families who lost their art, continued to wait for justice. The boat rocked gently in the evening swells as they absorbed this information. The secondary site, the shallow water location where his father had hidden the recovered cargo, lay just a few hundred yards away, tantalizingly close, yet protected by 22 feet of Atlantic Ocean. We need to see what's down there, Eli said finally. Agreed. But not tonight, and not with our friends watching. Sarah gestured toward the distant powerboat. Tomorrow, we come back with proper diving equipment and underwater cameras. We document everything thoroughly before we move a single piece. And then we contact Dr. Thornton and the Holocaust Art Recovery Program. We do this the right way, the way your father wanted it done. As they prepared to head back to harbor, Eli found himself thinking about the man he'd spent most of his adult life resenting. Every new discovery revealed another layer of his father's careful planning, another example of the patience and dedication Eli had mistaken for obsession and abandonment. The return trip to Harbor's End passed in contemplative silence, each of them processing the magnitude of what they'd learned. The pursuing boats maintained their distance but never lost sight of the weathered dream, a constant reminder that powerful interests were watching their every move. Murphy was waiting at the dock when they arrived, his weathered face creased with concern. Coast Guard was here asking questions, he said without preamble. Wanted to know about your boat registration, diving permits, salvage licenses. Told them you were just taking your daughter for a sunset cruise. Thanks, Murphy, Eli said, securing the boat's lines. Did they say what they were really looking for? Didn't have to. Tom Whitman was with them, not officially, mind you, but standing close enough to hear every answer. Murphy's expression was grim. That man's got connections, Eli, more than a simple treasure hunter should have. Sarah was already packing the waterproof case and its precious contents into her backpack. We need somewhere secure to study these documents. My hotel room isn't safe, and neither is yours. Mrs. Chen's house, June suggested. Nobody would think to look there, and she's got that big basement where she keeps all her preserving jars. It was, Eli realized, a brilliant suggestion. Elena Chen's Victorian house on Harbor Hill had been the town's unofficial sanctuary for decades. If there was anywhere in Harbor's End that Whitman's people wouldn't think to search, it would be the basement of a 70-year-old widow who collected antique preserving equipment. An hour later, they were spread around Mrs. Chen's kitchen table, while she bustled around making tea and sandwiches, with the efficient care of someone who'd spent her life feeding worried people. The correspondence between Eli's father and Dr. T's Thornton lay arranged in chronological order, telling the story of a 15-year collaboration that had gradually evolved from curiosity into careful archaeological work. Your father was remarkable, Mrs. Chen said, reading over Sarah's shoulder. All those years when people thought he was chasing fantasies, he was actually conducting serious historical research. Why didn't he tell anyone? Eli asked, still struggling with the years of anger and misunderstanding. Because he was protecting you, Sarah said gently. Look at this letter from 3 years ago. She held up a page covered in his father's careful handwriting. He explicitly tells Dr. Thornton that his son and family can't be involved for their own safety. He was afraid that if Meridian knew he had family, they'd use that as leverage. June looked up from her journal, where she'd been sketching the layout of the secondary site. So Grandpa left us to keep us safe, but he left us the boat so we could finish what he started. That's exactly what he did, Mrs. Chen said with quiet pride. Robert Mason spent his whole life trying to balance protecting his family with doing what was right. It's a hard balance to strike. Sarah spread out underwater photographs that had been included in the correspondence images of recovered art pieces lying on the ocean floor, carefully documented and catalogued before being moved to the secondary site. Paintings in waterproof cases, sculptures wrapped in protective materials, golden artifacts that gleamed even in the filtered underwater light. The authentication process alone took 2 years, Sarah explained. Each piece had to be compared against pre-war insurance records, family photographs, museum catalogs. Your father wasn't just recovering treasure, he was reuniting families with their stolen heritage. How much is it all worth? Eli asked, though he was beginning to understand that the financial value was almost secondary to the historical significance. According to Dr. Thornton's estimates, the recovered pieces have a total auction value of approximately $111 million. But their cultural and historical value is incalculable. Sarah paused, looking directly at Eli. And according to maritime law and the Holocaust Art Recovery Program, you're entitled to a finder's fee of 15%. The number hit Eli like a physical blow, $16.5 million. Enough to pay off Sarah's medical debts, secure June's education, buy a house, maybe even restore the boat to her former glory. But looking at his daughter's fascinated expression as she studied photographs of stolen Impressionist paintings, he realized that the money was just one part of a much larger story. There's something else, Mrs. Chen said quietly. She'd been reading the most recent letters, and her expression was troubled. Robert was planning to reveal everything this summer. He'd completed the authentication process, identified most of the original owners, and was ready to contact the authorities. What stopped him? This. She held up a letter dated just weeks before his father's death. It was from Meridian Recovery Corporation, but the tone was very different from their earlier correspondence. Instead of legal threats in corporate language, this letter was direct and personal. Mr. Mason, it read, our patience has reached its limits. You have information and assets that belong to our clients, and we are prepared to take whatever steps necessary to recover them. We are aware of your family situation, and would hate to see your son and granddaughter drawn into an unpleasant legal battle. Perhaps it's time we met in person to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. The letter was signed by Charles Whitman, but the threat was unmistakable. He was scared, Eli said, understanding flooding through him. For the first time in his life, Dad was actually scared. He was scared for you. Sarah corrected. The final letter in this collection is addressed to you, sealed, but never sent. She handed him an envelope marked with his name, in his father's familiar handwriting. Eli's hands shook as he opened it, revealing 2 pages of careful script that felt like his father's voice speaking across the months since his death. My dear son, it began, if you are reading this, then I am gone and the burden of this secret has fallen to you. I know you have every reason to hate me for the choices I made, for the distance I kept between us, for the father I failed to be. But I need you to understand that every decision I made was to protect you and June from the consequences of what I'd discovered. The letter went on to explain the full scope of the treasure, the legal complexities, the dangerous people involved, and the moral imperative to see the stolen art returned to its rightful owners. I have hidden the recovered pieces at coordinates I've marked in the boat knot, the Santa Isabella site, but a secondary location I prepared for safekeeping. The authentication documents are with Dr. Thornton at Woods Hole. If something happens to me, contact her immediately. She has the resources and connections to handle this properly. But most importantly, Eli, remember that this isn't about the money. This is about justice for families who lost everything to the Nazis and never got it back. This is about doing what's right, even when it's difficult. This is about leaving the world a little better than we found it. I love you more than I was ever able to show you. Take care of June, and help her understand that her grandfather wasn't a treasure hunter. He was a man trying to correct an old wrong. The letter was signed simply, Dad. Eli wiped his eyes, not caring that the others could see his tears. For the first time in 25 years, he felt like he understood his father. So what do we do now? He asked. Sarah was already reaching for her phone. Now we call Dr. Thornton and tell her it's time to finish what your father started. The diving log emerged from the boat's final hidden compartment, like a master's thesis written in salt water and determination. 3 decades of meticulous records, each page documenting another piece of the puzzle his father had been patiently solving. Hand-drawn sketches of ocean floor features, detailed notes about current patterns, weather conditions, equipment failures, and small victories accumulated over years of patient searching. Dr. Margaret Thornton arrived from Woods Hole the next morning, bringing with her the weight of academic authority and genuine grief for a colleague she'd respected deeply. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair, and the kind of steady competence that comes from decades of dealing with bureaucrats, treasure hunters, and the occasionally dangerous intersection of both. Robert was one of the most dedicated researchers I've ever worked with, she told them as she examined the diving log in Mrs. Chen's basement. Self-taught, but more methodical than most professionals. Look at these current calculations. He was mapping water movement patterns to predict debris distribution over a 70-year period. Eli studied the pages his father had filled with careful observations. Each dive was documented with scientific precision: date, time, weather conditions, visibility, water temperature, and detailed sketches of anything unusual found on the ocean floor. He was looking for the Santa Isabella for decades before he found her. Sarah noted, tracing the progression of search patterns across multiple years. These early entries show him systematically eliminating possible locations. And here, Dr. Thornton pointed to entries from 15 years ago, is when he started finding debris. Small pieces at first, metal fragments, pieces of cargo containers. But he catalogued everything, photographed it, documented its exact location. June was at the basement workbench, organizing the underwater photographs that had been stored with the diving log. The images showed the gradual recovery of an incredible collection. Paintings in specially designed waterproof cases, golden artifacts carefully extracted from the ship's hull, sculptures wrapped in protective materials that had somehow survived 7 decades underwater. Dr. Thornton, June said, holding up a photograph of what appeared to be a small bronze statue. How did Grandpa know which pieces were stolen by the Nazis? Excellent question. Your grandfather spent years cross-referencing what he found against databases of looted art. The Holocaust Art Recovery Program maintains detailed records of missing pieces, complete with photographs and ownership documentation. She pulled out a tablet and showed them official records. Every piece your grandfather recovered has been matched to a specific theft, a specific family. The scope of his father's research was staggering. Not only had he located and recovered the artwork, but he'd also identified the original owners and their descendants. Names and addresses were carefully noted in the margins of the diving log, along with photocopies of pre-war insurance records and family photographs showing the art in its original settings. This painting, Dr. Thornton said, indicating a photograph of a small impressionist landscape, belonged to the Goldstein family in Berlin. They were forced to abandon their home in 1938, and the painting was seized by Nazi officials. The family survived the war, emigrated to New York, but never recovered any of their possessions. Are they still alive? Eli asked. The children are. Sarah Goldstein is 86 and lives in Manhattan. She still has photographs of the painting hanging in her childhood home. Dr. Thornton's voice carried the weight of personal connection. Your father located her 2 years ago. She's been waiting to learn whether her family's painting had survived. The human dimension of the treasure hit Eli with unexpected force. This wasn't just about valuable artwork, it was about returning pieces of family history to people who'd lost everything to hatred and persecution. How many families are there? He asked. 43 that we've identified so far, Dr. Thornton replied. Some are large extended families, others are single survivors. But each piece represents someone's loss, someone's hope that their family's legacy hadn't been completely destroyed. Sarah was examining the technical aspects of the diving log, studying his father's equipment lists and safety protocols. He was diving alone for most of this, wasn't he? That's incredibly dangerous. Your father was aware of the risks, Dr. Thornton acknowledged, but he was also paranoid about security. He knew that if word got out about what he'd found, treasure hunters and corporate interests would descend on the site like vultures. People like Whitman, Eli said grimly. Exactly. Meridian Recovery Corporation has been circling maritime archaeological sites for decades, filing legal claims and tying up legitimate recovery efforts in courts. Your father knew that working alone was dangerous, but he also knew it was the only way to ensure the artwork would be returned to its rightful owners, rather than sold to private collectors. June had found a section of the diving log that included detailed sketches of the secondary site's shallow water location, where his father had carefully relocated the recovered pieces. The drawings showed an underwater storage system that was both ingenious and heartbreaking in its solitary dedication. He built an underwater museum, she said softly. Look, he made special cases for each piece, arranged them so they wouldn't be damaged by currents or marine life. It's like he was keeping them safe until someone could come and take them home. The afternoon was spent cataloging and cross-referencing the diving log against Dr. Thornton's official records. Each entry told part of a larger story of patient recovery and careful preservation. His father had been diving in increasingly difficult conditions as he aged, pushing himself to complete the work before time ran out. The last entries are concerning, Dr. Thornton noted, reading passages from just months before his father's death. He mentions being followed, feeling watched. He was convinced that Meridian had discovered his work and was preparing to interfere. He was right, Sarah said. Whitman admitted they'd been watching his research. They were waiting for him to do the dangerous work of location and recovery before moving in to claim ownership. That's why he died, Eli said, the certainty settling in his chest like a stone. He wasn't going to let them steal what he'd spent 30 years recovering. Dr. Thornton nodded gravely. The timing of his accident was suspicious. He was scheduled to meet with federal authorities the week after his death, ready to reveal everything and transfer the recovered pieces to proper custody. So now what? Eli asked. We know where the treasure is, we have documentation proving its provenance, and we know which families it belongs to. How do we get it to them? Very carefully, Dr. Thornton replied. First, we need to complete the recovery operation, using proper archaeological techniques. Then, we need to transport everything to a secure facility for final authentication and conservation. Finally, we coordinate with the Holocaust Art Recovery Program to contact the families and arrange for repatriation. And Whitman? Meridian will challenge everything in court. They'll claim prior research investment, salvage rights, finder's fees, anything to delay the process and pressure us into a settlement. The legal battle could take years. June looked up from the photographs she'd been studying. But we have Grandpa's research, right? Doesn't that prove he found everything first? It helps, but legal claims in maritime treasure recovery are complicated. Meridian has resources and lawyers we can't match. Dr. Thornton paused, studying Eli's expression. The question is, are you prepared for a long fight? Because once we start this process, there's no backing down. Eli thought about his father's letter, about the families waiting to recover their lost heritage, about June's pride in her grandfather's work. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. We finish what he started, he said firmly. All of it. The recovery, the authentication, the repatriation. Everything. Dr. Thornton smiled, for the first time since arriving. Then tomorrow, we dive. That evening, as they prepared the weathered dream for what might be the most important dive of their lives, Eli found himself thinking about legacy and justice, about the kind of man his father had really been, and about the kind of father he wanted to be for June. The diving log lay open on the navigation table, its final entry written in his father's shaking handwriting just days before his death. The work is almost complete. Soon, the families will have their treasures back, and I can rest knowing I did what was right. If something happens to me, I trust Eli to understand what this all means. He's stronger than he knows, and June has the heart of a true treasure hunter, not for gold, but for justice. Looking at his daughter as she carefully organized diving equipment with the methodical enthusiasm of someone who'd found her calling, Eli realized his father had been right about both of them. The death certificate arrived by courier at exactly 9 in the morning, delivered to Mrs. Chen's house, with the clinical efficiency of official business that would change everything. Dr. Thornton opened it with hands that trembled slightly, her face growing pale as she read the contents. "This isn't possible," she whispered. Eli looked up from the diving equipment he'd been checking. They were scheduled to begin the recovery operation in 2 hours. But something in Dr. Thornton's voice made him forget about regulators and depth gauges. "What is it?" "Your father's death certificate, the official cause of death." She held up the document, with the careful handling of someone touching evidence. "Robert didn't die from a heart attack, Eli. According to the medical examiner's findings, he died from acute poisoning. Digitoxin, a heart medication that's fatal in large doses." The words hit him like ice water. Someone murdered him? It appears so, but that's not the worst part. Dr. Thornton was reading further into the document, her expression growing more troubled. The medical examiner requested a full investigation, but it was overruled by someone higher up the chain. The case was closed within 24 hours and ruled accidental overdose. Sarah was already on her laptop, pulling up databases and cross-referencing information. Digitoxin isn't something you accidentally overdose on. It's a very specific cardiac medication, and the lethal dose is well established in medical literature. June had stopped organizing the underwater cameras and was listening with the intense focus she usually reserved for mysteries in her books. But this wasn't fiction, this was her grandfather's murder being discussed in Mrs. Chen's quiet basement. Who could have done this? Eli asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Someone with access to medical records, someone who knew exactly what medications your father was taking and how to make his death look natural. Dr. Thornton set down the death certificate with careful precision. Someone with enough influence to shut down a medical examiner's investigation. "Whitman," Sarah said grimly. "It has to be. Meridian Recovery Corporation has the resources and connections to arrange something like this." But Dr. Thornton was shaking her head. "I don't think Whitman has that kind of power. This required someone with serious government connections, someone who could shut down an investigation with a phone call." She paused, looking directly at Eli. "There's something else. Something your father never told me, but I think I'm beginning to understand." She pulled out her tablet and showed them a series of documents they hadn't seen before, shipping manifests and insurance records from 1943, but these were different from the earlier ones. More detailed, with cargo descriptions that made Eli's blood run cold. The Santa Isabella wasn't just carrying stolen art, Dr. Thornton said quietly. She was also transporting Nazi gold bullion that had been melted down from jewelry, dental work, and personal possessions stolen from concentration camp victims. The total weight was recorded as 3,000 pounds of gold, worth approximately $60 million by today's standards. The basement fell silent except for the distant sound of Harbor's End waking up above them. Eli felt the weight of this revelation settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. So the total treasure is actually worth more than $100 million? Much more. But that's not the important part. Dr. Thornton was pulling up more documents, files that looked like they came from government databases. The important part is that this gold was supposed to be recovered by the US government in 1945. There are classified documents showing that military investigators spent 2 years searching for the Santa Isabella, but they never found her. Because she was too deep, in the wrong location. Because someone in the military deliberately misdirected the search. The new voice came from the basement stairs, where a man in his 50s was descending with the careful movements of someone who'd announced himself upstairs and been invited down. Dr. Thornton rose quickly. "Agent Morrison, I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon. Plans changed when we intercepted communications, suggesting the recovery operation had been compromised." Agent Morrison showed them federal credentials, FBI, Financial Crimes Division. "Thornton contacted us yesterday about potential interference with a Holocaust art recovery operation. What she didn't know is that we've been investigating Meridian Recovery Corporation for the past 3 years." Eli felt like he was drowning in revelations. FBI? This is a federal investigation? Multiple federal investigations, actually. Meridian isn't just a treasure hunting company, they're a front operation for laundering stolen artifacts and precious metals. The Santa Isabella treasure represents the largest single recovery of Nazi gold in U.S. history, and there are people who will kill to keep it hidden. Agent Morrison settled into one of Mrs. Chen's kitchen chairs, with the weary efficiency of someone who'd been working this case for a long time. Your father stumbled into something much bigger than stolen artwork, Mr. Mason. He found evidence of a conspiracy that goes back 70 years. What kind of conspiracy? The kind where high-ranking military officers in 1945 decided that 3,000 pounds of Nazi gold would be more useful in private hands than returned to the families it was stolen from. Morrison pulled out a thick file folder. We believe the original search for the Santa Isabella was deliberately sabotaged to prevent recovery. The gold was written off as lost at sea, but certain individuals knew exactly where it was. Sarah was following the implications with growing alarm. So when Eli's father actually found the wreck, he became a threat to people who've been protecting this secret for decades. People with enough power to arrange an accidental death and shut down any investigation. June spoke up for the first time since the revelations began. Are we in danger too? Morrison's expression was grave. Yes. The people behind your grandfather's death know that you have his research, and they can't afford to let this treasure be recovered through legitimate channels. Eli looked around the basement at the evidence of his father's 30-year quest, the diving logs, the photographs, the careful documentation of families waiting to recover their stolen heritage. Everything his father had worked for was now part of a conspiracy that had cost him his life. What do we do? He asked. We finish the recovery operation, but we do it under federal protection, Morrison replied. My team has been waiting 3 years for enough evidence to move against the conspiracy. Your father's research provides that evidence, but only if we can recover the physical treasure and prove the connection between the Nazi gold and the current cover-up. Dr. Thornton was reading through Morrison's files with growing amazement. This involves current government officials. Retired officials mostly. But they still have connections, still have influence. Charles Whitman is just the front man. The real power behind Meridian comes from former military and intelligence officers who've been protecting this secret since 1945. The scope of what they were facing hit Eli like a physical blow. His father hadn't just been fighting corporate treasure hunters, he'd been fighting a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. So the diving operation today goes forward as planned, but with FBI support, Morrison said firmly. We have agents positioned around the harbor, Coast Guard vessels standing by, and federal warrants ready to arrest anyone who interferes with the recovery. June was studying Agent Morrison with the intense curiosity she usually reserved for new puzzles. Will the families still get their art back? Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving. That's exactly why we're doing this, young lady. Your grandfather died trying to return stolen property to its rightful owners. We're going to make sure that happens. As they prepared to leave for the harbor and the most dangerous dive of their lives, Eli felt the weight of his father's legacy settling around him like armor. This wasn't just about treasure anymore, it was about justice for Holocaust victims, accountability for a 70-year conspiracy, and ensuring that his daughter could grow up in a world where doing the right thing didn't get you murdered. The weathered dream waited at her slip like a faithful guardian, ready to complete the mission her previous owner had died trying to finish. But now she wouldn't be making the journey alone. Federal agents, Coast Guard vessels, and the full weight of American justice would be watching from the horizon as they finally brought Robert Mason's treasure home. The final map revealed itself in the pre-dawn darkness like a whispered secret finally ready to be heard. Hidden inside the boat's hull itself, carved into the inner framework, with the patience of someone who understood that the most important treasures were often the hardest to find. The coordinates and detailed recovery plan represented 3 generations of Mason family dedication to justice. Eli traced the carved lines with his fingertips, while Agent Morrison held a flashlight steady in the cramped space beneath the weathered Dreams deck. The map was ingenious in its simplicity, not a separate document that could be lost or stolen, but an integral part of the boat herself, waiting for the right person to look in the right place with the right understanding. Your grandfather started this, Morrison said quietly, pointing to initials, EM 1943, carved beside the earliest markings. Your father continued it, and now you're going to finish it. June was topside, officially staying with Mrs. Chen during the dangerous operation, but actually serving as their lookout with the binoculars and radio headset Agent Morrison had given her. Her voice crackled through the comm system with the professional efficiency of someone who'd appointed herself mission coordinator. Dad, there are 3 boats moving toward the harbor entrance. They don't look like fishing boats. Morrison's expression hardened. Meridians making their move. We expected this. He spoke into his own radio. Control, this is Morrison. Initiate maritime interdiction protocol. I want those boats stocked and searched before they reach international waters. The response was immediate and reassuring. Copy Morrison, Coast Guard Cutter Hamilton is moving to intercept. FBI maritime units are standing by. Dr. Thornton emerged from the cabin, where she'd been conducting final equipment checks. The recovery operation would require precision timing. They had a narrow window of optimal conditions, complicated by the need to document everything thoroughly, while staying ahead of corporate mercenaries who would stop at nothing to claim the treasure. Weather window looks perfect, she reported. Visibility should be excellent, currents are minimal, and we'll have about 4 hours of optimal diving conditions. Sarah was already in her wetsuit, checking the underwater cameras and documentation equipment that would prove the treasure's authenticity and establish legal chain of custody. Every piece would need to be photographed in situ, catalogued, and properly preserved for eventual return to the families who'd been waiting 70 years for justice. The authentication process has to be perfect, she said, testing the waterproof camera housing. One procedural mistake, and Meridian's lawyers will tie this up in courts for decades. Agent Morrison was coordinating with his team through an earpiece, receiving updates on the federal operations surrounding their dive. The scope of law enforcement involved was staggering. FBI, Coast Guard, State Department, and Holocaust Art Recovery Program representatives, all working together to ensure the operation's success. Intel suggests Meridian has divers in the water already, he reported. They're trying to reach the secondary site before we do, but they don't have the exact coordinates. Your father's final security measure was brilliant without the hull map. They're searching blind. Eli felt a surge of pride in his father's foresight, mixed with anxiety about the dangerous game they were playing. Men willing to commit murder for Nazi gold wouldn't hesitate to interfere with their diving operation, federal protection or not. How do we handle armed interference underwater? He asked. You don't. That's what we're for. Morrison gestured toward 2 Coast Guard divers who were completing their own equipment checks nearby. Professional protection, underwater communications, and emergency extraction if things go wrong. June's voice came through the radio again, tighter with concern. Dad, Agent Morrison, there are people on the dock. They're not from town. Through the cabin windows, Eli could see unfamiliar figures moving with military precision around the harbor. 2 well-dressed for fishermen, 2 alert for tourists. They had the unmistakable bearing of private security contractors. Time to go, Morrison decided. Every minute we wait gives them more opportunity to interfere. The weathered Dream pulled away from her slip as the first rays of sunrise painted harbor's end in shades of gold and rose. Behind them, the town that had been Eli's refuge and burden looked peaceful in the morning light, giving no hint of the federal operation unfolding in its waters. June's radio crackled with updates as they cleared the harbor entrance. Coast Guard cutter has intercepted the 3 boats. They're conducting safety inspections and documentation checks. That should slow them down for a while. Good girl, Eli replied, his pride in his daughter's composure, under pressure mixing with worry about the danger they were facing. She'd already lost her mother. The thought of losing her father to the same conspiracy that had killed her grandfather was almost unbearable. The coordinates from the hull map led them to a position 2 miles southeast of the original Santa Isabella wreck site, in shallower water that would make diving easier but also more visible to anyone watching from the surface. Agent Morrison's federal boats maintained a protective perimeter while local Coast Guard vessels discouraged civilian traffic from approaching the area. Final equipment check, Dr. Thornton announced as they approached the dive site. Underwater cameras, documentation materials, recovery bags, emergency signaling devices. This needs to be fast, thorough, and absolutely legal. The sonar screen showed the secondary site exactly as his father's diving log had described. ITAN, organized underwater storage facility, where stolen art and Nazi gold had been carefully preserved for eventual recovery. 30 years of his father's work, waiting 22 feet below the surface for the right people to bring it home. Remember, Sarah said as they prepared to enter the water. We're not treasure hunters. We're conducting a Holocaust art recovery operation under federal authority. Every piece we bring up represents someone's family history, someone's hope for justice. Agent Morrison's voice came through their underwater communication system as they descended toward the ocean floor. Federal assets are in position. You have full legal authority for this recovery. Document everything. Take your time, and remember you're doing exactly what your father would have wanted. The secondary site appeared in the underwater lights, like a carefully curated museum exhibition that had been waiting decades for its first visitors. Paintings in protective cases, sculptures wrapped in preservation materials, and containers of gold artifacts arranged with the methodical care of someone who understood that these weren't just valuable objects, they were pieces of families, destroyed by hatred and war. Eli floated above his father's underwater sanctuary, overwhelmed by the scope of dedication and planning required to create this hidden repository of justice. Every case, every container, every protective wrapping represented hours of careful work by a man who died before seeing his mission completed. It's incredible. Sarah's voice crackled through the comm system. The preservation is perfect. These pieces look like they were stored yesterday. Dr. Thornton was already documenting the site with professional efficiency, her underwater cameras capturing every detail for legal and historical records. Beginning systematic recovery of identified pieces. Authentication will be conducted topside, under federal supervision. The first container they opened contained a Van Gogh landscape that had been stolen from the Goldstein family in Berlin. Floating in the crystal clear water, protected by his father's careful preservation, the painting seemed to glow with its own internal lighter, masterpiece returning to the world after 7 decades of darkness. Sarah Goldstein in Manhattan, Eli murmured, remembering Dr. Thornton's research. She's been waiting her whole life to see this again. And now she will, Agent Morrison's voice replied through the comm system. Thanks to your father's work and your courage to finish it. As they worked to document and recover piece after piece of stolen heritage, Eli felt his father's presence like a benediction. This was what the old man had lived for, died for, not the money, not the glory, but the simple justice of returning stolen property to its rightful owners. Above them, the weathered Dream waited patiently on the surface, no longer just a boat, but a symbol of 3 generations of Mason family dedication to doing what was right, no matter how dangerous or difficult the path. The ship's bell emerged from the ocean floor, like a voice calling across 7 decades of silence. Engraved with SS, Santa Isabella, 1941. The brass bell provided undeniable proof that they had found the right wreck, the right cargo, and the right cause worth fighting for. Eli held the bell in his hands 22 feet below the surface, feeling its weight as both physical artifact and symbol of everything his father had died trying to accomplish. The brass was green with patina, but the engraving remained clear, testament to the craftsmanship of an era when ships were built to last and carry precious cargo safely across dangerous waters. That's our proof of authenticity, Dr. Thornton's voice crackled through the underwater communication system. With the ship's bell and the cargo manifest, we can establish legal provenance for every piece in the collection. Sarah was documenting the recovery with methodical precision, her underwater cameras capturing every angle of the bell's removal from its resting place among the preserved artifacts. The chain of custody had to be perfect. Tone procedural error could give Meridian's lawyers the opening they needed to challenge the entire operation. But their methodical work was interrupted by the sound of additional dive equipment entering the water above them. Agent Morrison's voice came through their comm system with urgent warning. We have unauthorized divers approaching your position. 3 individuals in commercial diving gear approaching from the northeast. They're not responding to Coast Guard commands to surface. Eli looked up through the clear water to see dark figures descending toward their position, with the aggressive efficiency of people who had no intention of following federal orders. These weren't treasure hunters, they moved with military precision, and their equipment looked expensive and professional. Meridian? Sarah asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Has to be. They're making their play while we're vulnerable underwater. Agent Morrison's tone was grim. Federal divers are responding, but you need to secure the most valuable pieces immediately. The approaching divers were closing fast. Their intentions unclear, but certainly not friendly. Eli felt a surge of protective anger. These were the people who'd murdered his father, who'd spent decades protecting a conspiracy built on Nazi gold and stolen art. They would not succeed in stealing what his father had died, trying to return to its rightful owners. The Van Gogh, Dr. Thornton said urgently. If we can only save one piece, it has to be the Van Gogh. It's worth $12 million and belongs to Sarah Goldstein. But as they moved toward the